Researchers from Italy's Institute of Crystallography used advanced X-ray technology to analyze the cloth, suggesting it might actually date back to the 1st century, which could coincide with the time of Jesus. This challenges the previous carbon dating results from 1988.
David Rolfe has been trying to be proven wrong for 40 years. He put $1 million on it, a publicly documented cash prize to any scientist, any artist, any laboratory, anywhere on Earth, using any technology they choose to reproduce one image on a piece of ancient linen. The conditions are not complicated. Match the chemistry, the depth, and the three-dimensional data encoded into the fibers. Reproduce what is on that cloth by any means necessary, and the money is yours. Nobody has collected, not once in 4 decades. That $1 million challenge is the end of a story that began in a London office in 1976, when a photograph fell out of an envelope and landed on the floor. David Rolfe was an atheist then. He had no interest in Jesus Christ, no belief in resurrection, no emotional attachment to any relic associated with either. He was a professional documentary filmmaker whose entire worldview rested on the assumption that the material world was the only world that existed. He was the last person on Earth you would expect this story to happen to. And that is precisely what makes it worth telling. What Rolfe saw when he picked that photograph up off the floor was a face, sharp, detailed, hauntingly anatomical, eyes closed, a broken nose, a forked beard, an expression of absolute devastating calm on someone who had endured something catastrophic. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking at the photographic negative of the Turin Shroud, and the fact that it was already a negative, already reversed, already waiting to be flipped by something that wouldn't be invented for another 8 centuries was the first thing about it that made no sense. It would not be the last. Rolfe set out to expose a fraud. That was the idea. He would make a documentary, find the logical scientific explanation for the image, and the mystery would dissolve. He later described what happened during that investigation with a simplicity that said everything. He said he found God. His finished film, The Silent Witness, won the BAFTA for Best Documentary in 1978. It did not expose a fraud. It asked a question, the same question Rolfe has been asking for 40 years, the same question no one has answered, the question the $1 million prize is built around. Who is this man? Here is what Rolfe found, and here is why it took 40 years to understand what it meant. The story of the Shroud doesn't start in 1978. It starts on May 28, 1898, in a dark room in Turin with a man who nearly dropped a priceless glass plate when he saw what appeared on it. Secondo Pia had been given rare permission by King Umberto I to photograph the Shroud during a royal exhibition. Photography in 1898 is brutal physical work. No digital sensors, no preview screens. Pia hauls a camera the size of a suitcase onto scaffolding inside the cathedral, fires violent magnesium flashes, and exposes 2 enormous glass plates. Late that night, alone under the faint red glow of a safety lamp, he lowers a plate into developing chemicals, and the image that materializes nearly makes him drop it. On a photographic negative, everything reverses. Light becomes dark, dark becomes light. Faces become hollow, distorted masks with empty eyes. That is the fundamental law of photography. The Shroud broke it. What appeared on Pia's plate was not distortion. It was a portrait. Sharp, hauntingly realistic, anatomically precise. Eyes gently closed. A broken nose, bruising along the right cheek, a forked beard. The expression of a man at absolute peace after extreme suffering. Here is what this means. The image on the cloth itself is already a negative. A negative of a negative produces a positive, and that positive image, hidden inside the tonal reversal for centuries, is anatomically correct, proportionally accurate, and detailed beyond anything any known artistic method in history can explain. Ask the question that no one in 1898 could answer. Who in the medieval world, 8 centuries before photography existed, understood the concept of a photographic negative? Who could compose a flawless reversed image across 14 feet of linen without any way to see, test, or verify the result? The human eye cannot perceive the world in tonal reversal. The human brain cannot compose an image in reversed values. No medieval artist had any reason to attempt this. No modern artist has successfully replicated it. That was the crack in the wall. It would not close. February 1976, Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs. Physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed a photograph of the Shroud into a VP-8 image analyzer, a Cold War device originally built for mapping planetary surfaces from satellite data. You feed it a flat image. Bright areas rise, dark areas sink. It generates a three-dimensional topographic model. They had already tested dozens of images before this. Paintings, photographs, sketches, X-rays, everyone produced meaningless, distorted garbage. Because in a normal image, brightness represents reflected light, not physical distance. A bright spot on a face doesn't mean that part of the face is closer to the camera. It means the light hit it at a certain angle. The VP-8 cannot translate reflected light into meaningful three-dimensional relief. The Shroud produced a perfect, rotable, three-dimensional human body. Peter Schumacher, the engineer who built the VP-8, had never heard of the Shroud. His account of what he saw, it was unlike anything he had ever processed through the analyzer before or since. A geometrically accurate form. Nose, cheekbones, brow ridge, chest, crossed hands, legs, all correctly contoured, all rotatable without distortion. Image intensity at every point corresponded precisely to the distance between the body and the cloth above it. Not reflected light, distance, three-dimensional spatial data encoded into ancient linen. In nearly 50 years since, no image, painted, photographed, or digitally generated has reproduced this result. Not one. This is the moment the investigation changed for Rolf. He had gone in expecting paint. What Jackson and Jumper's machine showed him was something that didn't have a name. Something that encoded spatial information the way a radar encodes terrain, not the way a hand encodes an image. Something that knew where the body was, not what it looked like. He described it later as the point where his idea of how to debunk the Shroud ran out of road. Then there was the blood. In 1978, when the full STURP team assembled 33 scientists from Los Alamos, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Air Force Academy, they spent 120 continuous hours running every available test on the cloth. X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet photography, and microchemical analysis. When chemists John Heller and Alan Adler examined the blood directly, they confirmed hemoglobin, albumin, and hemiporphyrin derivatives. They found serum halos, the pale rings that form when blood separates as it dries, a forensic phenomenon not understood until the modern era. No medieval painter would have known to reproduce them because no medieval painter knew they existed. But here is the observation that eliminates every forgery theory with a single stroke. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. Underneath every blood stain, there is no body image, none. The image stops cleanly at the edge of every blood deposit, as if whatever created the image operated around the blood already there. A forger paints the body first, then adds blood on top. Every artist in every century works that way. The Shroud does it backwards. Blood first, image second. That sequence alone eliminates painting, rubbing, printing, and every contact transfer method ever proposed. And the blood tells a darker story still. Researchers at the University of Padua examined Shroud blood fibers at the atomic level and found creatinine nanoparticles at concentrations that appear in only one clinical scenario. Rhabdomyolysis, the systemic destruction of skeletal muscle from prolonged, extreme torture. The person whose blood is on this cloth had his muscles dissolving into his bloodstream before the crucifixion had even begun. Now look at the nail wounds. Every crucifixion painting you have ever seen gets this wrong. Michelangelo, Caravaggio, Rubens, all of them show nails through the palms because that is what artists assumed for 1,000 years of Christian art. In the 1930s, French surgeon Pierre Barbet drove nails through cadaver hands and proved that palm tissue cannot support a body's weight. The nails tear clean through. Crucifixion requires nailing through destos space a small gap between the wrist bones that can actually bear the full load. And every time Barbet nailed through that space, the same thing happened. The median nerve was severed. The thumb snapped violently inward against the palm. Look at the shroud. Count the fingers on each hand. 4, not 5. The thumbs are folded into the palms, invisible from the back of the hand. Exactly what happens when a nail destroys the median nerve. Exactly what no medieval artist knew. No one knew this until modern anatomy demonstrated it in the 20th century. Every crucifixion painting in history gets this detail wrong. The Shroud gets it right. Here's where it becomes very difficult to dismiss. In the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, northern Spain, there is a second cloth, smaller, about 33 inches, just blood and fluid stains. It is called the Sudarium of Oviedo, the face cloth. Its documented history traces to at least 570 CE, with a recorded journey from Jerusalem in 614 CE, fleeing the Persian invasion. On March 14, 1075, the chest containing the Sudarium was officially opened in a ceremony witnessed by King Alfonso VI of Spain. Standing beside him was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the man history knows as El Cid, one of the most documented military figures of the medieval world. That is not legend. That is a recorded historical event with named witnesses. 2 cloths, 2 countries, 2 completely separate chains of custody, one in Turin, one in northern Spain. They have never been in the same room. Blood type AB on both. Stain patterns that match the facial dimensions of the shroud. When overlaid using polarized image technology, researchers found 70 points of coincidence on the front and 50 on the back. Calculated nose length from fluid flow, approximately 3 inches, identical between both cloths. Thorn puncture wounds on the back of the head align precisely. If these 2 cloths covered the same face and the forensic overlap is extraordinary, then the Sudarium, with its documented existence centuries before the carbon date, independently proves the Turin cloth cannot be a medieval forgery. You would need to forge both cloths in 2 separate countries with matching blood types, matching wound patterns, matching anatomical measurements, all before the invention of forensic science. Then there's the DNA. In 2015, geneticist Gianni Barcaccia published a study in Nature Scientific Reports. His team extracted dust from deep within the shroud's weave and sequenced the mitochondrial DNA. If the cloth was a French forgery from 1350, European DNA should dominate. If it had never traveled, Middle Eastern DNA should dominate. Neither happened. Haplogroup H33, found almost exclusively among the Druze, a tightly isolated community in the mountains of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, whose DNA has remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. Western European haplogroups consistent with centuries of handling by French and Italian clergy. Markers from East Africa, from the Indian subcontinent, from East Asia. Biological traces from 5 continents, recorded in molecules invisible to anyone who ever handled the cloth. A forger in 14th century France could not have collected that material. No trade network in existence could have deposited genetically identifiable traces from that many regions of the world onto one piece of fabric unless the cloth wasn't forged in France, unless it had traveled. The pollen confirmed the route. Swiss criminologist Max Frey and Israeli botanist Avinoam Danon identified pollen from 58 plant species on the cloth, 17 European expected from centuries in France and Italy, but the majority came from the Middle East, from Turkey, and from a narrow corridor between Jerusalem and Jericho. One plant dominated, Gundalia tourneforti, a thorny desert thistle with long needle-like spines. Its pollen made up nearly a third of all grains, concentrated heavily around the head area of the cloth. It blooms near Jerusalem in early spring, the season of Passover. A crown of thorns written in pollen, invisible for 2,000 years. Now the test that supposedly settled everything. October 13, 1988. 3 elite radiocarbon laboratories, the University of Arizona, the University of Oxford, and ETH Zurich, released simultaneous results on samples cut from the Shroud. The conclusion, 1260 to 1390 CE medieval, 95% confidence. Oxford's Professor Edward Hall stood in front of a blackboard with the dates written on it and told reporters that someone had simply gotten a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it. He compared believers to flat earthers. The New York Times ran it on the front page. Every newspaper in the Western world printed the same conclusion the next morning. Case closed. That headline went everywhere. What happened next went almost nowhere. The original 1986 protocol for the test called for 7 laboratories, multiple sample sites from across the cloth, and blind testing supervised by 3 independent institutions. By the time the Vatican finished negotiating, the protocol had been stripped to almost nothing. 3 labs, 1 sample site, 1 supervisor, the British Museum. The blind test was abandoned because the Shroud's distinctive herringbone weave made it instantly identifiable to any expert in the room. The single sample came from the most handled corner of the entire cloth, the very edge that bishops and cardinals had gripped during public exhibitions for centuries, saturated with sweat, candle wax, incense smoke, and the biological residue of 1,000 hands across hundreds of years. Now here enters Raymond Rogers. Rogers was a fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He had been Stirp's lead chemist in 1978. He was a founding editor of Thermochimica Acta, a major peer-reviewed chemistry journal. He was not a believer. He thought the repair patch theory was ludicrous and set out to disprove it. Then he looked at the actual threads. Comparing fibers from the carbon-dated corner with threads he had personally collected from the rest of the cloth in 1978, Rogers found completely different chemical compositions. The carbon-dated sample contained cotton, a Near Eastern variety called Gossypium herbaceum, interwoven with the linen, cotton absent from every other part of the cloth. The sample was coated with yellow-brown plant gum containing alizarin dye from madder root, bonded with gum arabic, materials found nowhere else on the entire cloth. The medieval nuns who repaired the Shroud after a catastrophic fire in 1532 had not merely patched the visible burn holes. They had expertly woven new cotton threads into the original linen, dyed to match the aged color, bonded with plant gum to make the repair invisible to the naked eye. The 3 most prestigious radiocarbon labs in the world had dated the repair, not the Shroud. Rogers published his findings in Thermochimica Acta in January 2005. His conclusion was blunt: the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth. The date was not valid. He died on March 8, 2005, 2 months after publication. Then in 2017, French researcher Tristan Casabianca used British Freedom of Information law to force the release of the raw data from the 1988 test, data that had been locked away for 30 years. What he found in those 711 pages was devastating. The statistical agreement index across the measurements was just 28%, catastrophically low for any test claiming 95% confidence. The headline that ended the debate for 1 billion people was built on contaminated material, statistically incoherent data, hidden for 30 years, from a sample location that everyone involved knew was not representative of the original cloth. And the man who supervised the test, Dr. Michael Tite of the British Museum, was rewarded shortly after the result was announced when 45 wealthy donors contributed £1 million to endow the Edward Hall Chair of Archaeological Sciences at Oxford. The first person appointed to that position was Dr. Michael Tite, the man who had overseen the protocol, handled the samples, and managed communications between labs. That is not proof of misconduct. But in any other scientific field, that is exactly the kind of institutional entanglement that would trigger an immediate investigation. It triggered nothing, because the headline had already done its work. Now here is the part that brought David Rolfe to his knees, and that question that the $1 million prize is built around. Stirp's 1981 conclusion after 3 years of peer review was this: no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils. Thermal burns fluoresce under ultraviolet light. The body image doesn't. Not a photograph. It encodes 3-dimensional spatial data no photograph can produce. Those create blurred, directionless stains. The image exists only on the outermost 200 nanometers of the linen fibers. 200 nanometers. Thinner than a single bacterium, it is a chemical change, oxidation, and dehydration of cellulose at the fiber's absolute surface. The atoms have been rearranged. Each individual fiber is either colored or uncolored, a binary effect like the dots in a newspaper photograph. And here is the detail that stops every conversation cold. That 200 nanometer depth is not just shallow, it is uniform, perfectly, inexplicably uniform across the entire 14 feet of cloth, across areas where the cloth was in direct contact with the body and areas separated from it by centimeters of air. Every real-world mechanism, every contact process, every vapor, every form of radiation produces variation. Some areas penetrate deeper, some shallower, depending on distance, angle, and pressure. The Shroud has none of that variation, uniform everywhere, without exception. Stirp's final published report contained an admission almost never seen in scientific literature. They wrote that some explanations which might work chemically were completely eliminated by the physics, and that certain physical explanations were completely eliminated by the chemistry. The image mechanism, they concluded, remained a mystery. Italy's ENIA laboratory then spent 5 years trying to solve it. Physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro and his team irradiated linen with excimer lasers at 193 nanometers, deep vacuum ultraviolet, the closest technology available to producing the right kind of superficial chemical change. They achieved coloration on tiny sample patches that partially resembled the Shroud's properties. But to reproduce the full-body image across the entire cloth, approximately 2,600 square inches, their calculations required a simultaneous energy pulse of 34 trillion watts, lasting less than 1/billionth of a second, powerful enough to alter the surface chemistry precisely, precise enough not to scorch the fibers immediately beneath. No technology on Earth can produce that pulse, not in any laboratory, not anywhere. Di Lazzaro said it directly. It is almost impossible to replicate all the main characteristics of the body image using any technology available in the Middle Ages or later. That is the question Rolf put $1 million behind. If anyone can explain the image, if anyone can reproduce it with all its documented properties, the money is theirs. He made that offer publicly. He has repeated it for years. He describes the terms this way: a photographic negative image of a crucified man on a 14-foot piece of linen without using ink, paint, or any added agent, with the same color intensity on both sides of the cloth, with blood stains carrying the same chemical composition as those on the Shroud, including hemoglobin and bilirubin. Nobody has claimed it. Here is how to understand what 40 years means in this story. In 1976, Rolf was an atheist in a Soho office watching a photograph fall out of an envelope. He had no reason to pay attention to it, no religious curiosity. He looked at it the way a professional photographer looks at any image, which means he saw immediately that it was a positive face inside what should have been a reversed negative. And he understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent years working with cameras and film, that no human hand could have composed that image in tonal reversal across 14 feet of cloth and gotten it right. That was the beginning, not the end. What followed was 40 years of watching the evidence accumulate, in laboratories that had no contact with each other, in fields that share no common methodology, all pointing to the same location and the same time. The blood sequence no forger could have reversed, the wrist wounds no artist knew about, the DNA from 5 continents mapping a 2,000-year journey, the pollen from outside Jerusalem concentrated around the head, the statistical wreckage of a carbon test built on a medieval repair patch, and the image itself encoded at a depth no known process can achieve, with a uniformity no known mechanism can explain, surviving molten silver dripping through the folded cloth in a fire hot enough to partially liquefy its container. Rolf said it plainly. He started as an atheist, became an agnostic, and then across those 40 years, the evidence left him nowhere else to go. He became a Christian, not because a priest convinced him, not because he wanted to believe, because the image on the cloth behaved the way nothing made by human hands has ever behaved before or since. I am not telling you the Shroud of Turin is authentic, I am telling you the case was never closed. It was buried under a headline that circled the globe in 1988, and the correction has never come close to catching up. Somewhere in Turin, behind bulletproof glass sealed in climate-controlled argon, a piece of linen sits folded in the dark. It carries blood that is still red. An image no laboratory has explained, the testimony written in molecules, not words, of a death so violent and so specific that it has resisted every explanation science has offered it for 40 years. David Rolfe's $1 million is still on the table. It has been there for decades. No one has come close to claiming it. Subscribe if you want to follow where this evidence goes next. And tell me in the comments, after everything you've just heard, do you think the Shroud is real, or is there an explanation we haven't found yet? Because this conversation is nowhere near finished.